What's up, guys? Hello. Welcome. My name is Darrell Thorp, and I'm here today for FAQ Friday.
When recording a larger drum kit, how do you deal with the various drums and cymbals that ring out when they're hitting the other drums or the kick?
In that scenario, tracking usually means the drums aren't tuned quite right. Now, that's not the rule of thumb, once again. But you can kind of tell pretty quickly when you just start, the drummer's out there and he's playing, if you just solo the snare up and like some of the toms up, and then you listen to what ambient noise those mics are picking up on those isolated instruments. Toms will ring no matter what, but I have noticed depending on their tuning, they will ring less, and or dampening, they will ring less. So you can yin and yang it, hit the drum, hit the tom, rack, floor, whatever it is. Okay, it sounds good, but maybe it is too long. So start putting pieces of tape around the edges to start dampening it down a smidge so it doesn't ring out as much. That is just sort of like going to the source of it. The second part is microphone choice and or microphone placement can be a huge factor. Loudon Audio, just going to throw it out there, like the 308 and or the tom mic and the snare mic are they have a high rejection weight, so they will just pick up the source of what you're pointing at. That is one way. I'm sure there's other microphones that have a kind of a narrow point. I have not used some of them only because I'm such a huge fan of what Loudon makes, especially in that very application. So that's one way too. I love condensers on drums. I'll put condensers everywhere. However, problem with condenser is depending on the drummer and the tuning of the kit, it's just going to pick up anything that's around it. That's just the nature of the beast. Whereas like a dynamic, like 421, still going to pick up sources outside of what you're trying to mic, but it's going to be, the pattern's going to be smaller and you're just going to pick up more of what you're aiming for. If you're mixing and something's been recorded, then you're just having to, especially the toms themselves or the snare or the kick drum, bass drum, then it comes into gating. Depending on how much isolating you got to do, let's see, Oxford Drum Gate's really good for that. Is it Black Salt Audio that makes the silencer? That's a brand new plugin that's really good for drum gating. And then last but not least, one of my favorites is Sound Radic's Drum Leveler. Also has a really good gating feature. A little bit more versatile than the Oxford Drum Gate or silencer will, because you can actually, if the bleed that's coming through a snare or a tom is actually useful information in your mix and you're just trying to contain it or control it, Drum Leveler will look at the peaks of the source, i.e. the snare, and then turn down the ambient stuff around it. It's really cool like that. Highly recommend you just check that one out as well and seeing if you can download it and try it in your arsenal. But that's generally my two schools or several schools of thought about how to control ambient bleed around or inside of a drum kit as a whole.
What kind of solutions do you have if sessions aren't going well? Like a singer that feels blocked during recording or a musician that doesn't feel at ease?
Psychology 101, dude. Is it their first time in the studio? Are they feeling extremely nervous? A lot of times it comes to the simple fact of artist comes in with their guitar, which could be good or different or not great. And then you, as the producer or studio owner, might have something that's, let's just air quote, better, right? Hey man, why don't you try my, don't say it to the artist, better guitar. And then artist is trying to play it, but it doesn't feel the same to them. It doesn't sound the same to them. It doesn't rake the same to them. They wrote that song on their guitar. And so becomes this like mental roadblock, because every time I hit that G chord, it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't break up right, because every guitar is a different thing. Every amp is a different thing. Every microphone is a different thing. So it's just something about the way they're used to hearing that G chord come through, and it doesn't ring the same to them. And so it's kind of bumming them out, and it doesn't feel right to them. So then that's a scenario of like, well, okay, well, then ask them like, and it's funny. I had this very thing happen 3 times this year. One was with the artist trying to sing. I put a very fancy, expensive mic, and that really, they just couldn't. Why do I sound so good to myself in my headphones right now? That was such a very altering, uncomfortable feeling situation for them. So I finally was like, after it, and it took a little bit of trial and error for me to kind of figure out like, what's going on here? How come you're not knocking it out of the park right now? And finally openly admitted, I'm just used to singing on a 58. Well, dude, come on into the control room and just sit down in front of the speakers and sing on a 58. And then, it came together quickly. Another instance was, it was the artist's guitar, but different amp. Something about the way the amp just didn't quite distort, and then went back to the amp room, kind of pulled some stuff. Oh, this is really similar to what I use. Okay, let's plug it in, dude. Da-da-da. And then within 5 minutes, we had the amp tone that was his timbre and his tone that he was used to hearing. And then boom, from there, we started cutting, and we were just going through take after take after take after take. Honestly, it's usually little nuances like that, or it's just, quite frankly, somebody who's new and uncomfortable. I think in that case, it's just, is the lighting right? Is the mood right? Is it, do we need to change something in the tone? Should it just be a 57 on the amp instead of an 87? Usually you kind of got to just ask the artist like, hey, something's not feeling right here. I can sense a little roadblock, a mental roadblock or something. Cause I've seen you play this part before with no problem. Like what's going on? What's different about it that we can figure it out? And usually they might just fess up and go, I don't like the guitar tone. Okay, cool. Is it the guitar? Is it the amp? Is it just the mic? Like, should I just put a 57 instead of an 87 or something? That scenario. Or is it just like a 121? I don't know. That's generally a really good place to start in a session that's got roadblocks, where you're finding people can't perform.
When do you know your mix is finished?
I came up with a rule a long time ago that when I'm turning the vocal up 1, and then I turn it down 1, and then I'm turning the bass up 1, and then I'm turning the bass down 1, and then I turn the snare up 1, and then I turn the snare down 1. I'm at that process of the day, whether that took me 4 hours to get there, or 6 hours to get there, or 8 hours to get there, or 2 days to get there. That's when it's like, mix is done. Send it off. That being said, I don't want to be too cocky about it in the sense of like, well, am I doing all this stuff because I am missing something? Generally, I've always felt like I'm aware of when something is not meshing, gelling right in the mix. Too much mud, too much low end, too much high end, too bright, too dark. Vocals not loud enough. Vocals buried in I don't know. Whatever the scenario may be. And if I'm doing stuff like that, turning the vocal up, turning it down, turn the reverb up, turn the reverb down, shorten the reverb, make it longer, blah, blah, blah. If I'm doing stuff like that, then I know I'm searching for something that I haven't found. And I can't quite put my thumb on it quite yet because I'm too into it. So it's either like take a break real quick, or just straight up print a mix, close it for the night, go home, clear your head, listen fresh ears in the morning, because usually right then and there you'll go, oh, this is what's bothering me. That happens to me a lot. However, there's just the feeling of I'm just tweaking on stuff, just the sake of tweaking on stuff. And I kind of actually the mix is done, or at least done in a really good representation to send to the artist or client to get their feedback on the direction.
What is your advice for handling recalls, especially when the client isn't the best at explaining what they want, or if there is a language barrier?
Trying to decipher recall notes from a client who either can't explain technically what they're looking for, or what they're hearing is wrong to them, or that there's an issue, like an actual technical issue in some way, shape, or form. is a very, very difficult thing to do. It's still hard for me to navigate through a client's mix changes. Some people are asking for as simple as more reverb or a different reverb, and they might be saying ambience or which is pretty easy to do. But I do find that a lot of scenarios, for example, like maybe kick drum could be too big or too loud, and they could just be saying something like, well, the kick drum is taking too much space. Okay, well, at least I know that they're actually talking about the instrument itself. But when they say it's taking up too much space, then to me, I'm thinking, well, is it too ambient? Is it actually just physically too big sounding in size in the mix? Or is it just simply a volume adjustment? I find that trying to ask a little bit more specific questions about their comments sometimes does help narrow it down to what I think that they are trying to ask me to chew or to change. However, I am fortunately with platforms like Sound Better, I'm finding more and more clients who are not necessarily English speaking. That's not their first language. So then there does come into play a bit of a language barrier. But I work through that. And then it becomes, well, if the client could be in a completely different time zone than where I live in Los Angeles, and the client could be Europe, Eastern Europe, or Australia or Asia, I found that the time difference can be also a big hindrance, because you could get notes first thing in the morning for you, but your client is already asleep. So then it's like, well, I'll send them back an email now about what I need more specifics about the vocal or the kick drum. It really is just a trial and error process. There also is platforms that you can get online. So hopefully you can find a time that works for both of yourself, depending on where you are and where your client lives. As professionals, I'm trying to do the best possible mix for my client and their songs. And I really want to figure out, like, what is it exactly that they're looking for? I'm sorry to say, on a lot of occasions, a little bit, unfortunately, of trial and error. And I have noticed it's a little bit more when a client sends you a note that's very vague or a broader stroke suggestion that they want changed, like the kick drum, for example. I may read into it as being, well, I think that they're saying the kick drum is too big in the mix. So if I just want to remove low end that I've added, for example, I will then copy their notes and then paste them, and in either a different font or a different color shading, explain to them in each step, this is what I did to the next mix, i.e., I really think that you're saying the kick drum's too big. So I took a couple dB, removed a couple dB at 80 hertz or something. I'm finding that more and more works, because that way when they hear the newest version back, they can say, oh, dude, I heard what you did, but that's not what I'm talking about. Okay, great. It's actually I think it's just volume. It seems to bounce off of them in a way that they can kind of define a little bit more solidified option of what exactly they're looking for in a mix. The same thing can go with reverbs. It can be a situation of the vocal sounds really good, but I don't like the reverb sound. Okay, well, that's once again very vague. Is it that it's the reverb's too long, too loud, the size is the wrong space, or is it just the simple fact that I have a plate currently on your lead vocal and they're thinking of more like a room sound? That's another thing. Replying back to them, hey, you said something about the reverb on the vocal being too big, very vague. I'm using a plate just for safety. It was at 2.5 seconds. I'm now at 2 seconds, and I've also turned it down 2 dB in the mix. How does this feel? Back to them, question mark. I'm finding little nuances like that can really help the conversation along, especially with emails. It's funny, I kind of prefer the email chain of mixed notes to me. It's just sort of like it's a way for me to checklist that I don't forget stuff, just my organization. Especially when you've got a client in a different time zone, that does help because they can just send you an email and you can get to it when you have time for it in your day. Last but not least, yeah, if you can, there's a way to actually stream and mix them with several services that are out there right now. And that way you could get online and try to narrow down what they're trying to look for. That helps. Or just simply, if they're in the same town, invite them down to your studio and sit down with them for a few hours and get that one-on-one experience. You can really dial in what they're looking for. I set a limit with new clients at 10 recalls. I kind of feel like that's a fair number, but at the end of the day, I try to be cool and understanding, because if you're I kind of think around recall number 6, 7, you're really dialing in. And by then and there, the client's sort of just getting a little nitpicky on the vocal being up a half dB or the bass being down a half dB or a dB or whatever it is. So then you're starting to, you've really dialed in the mix, and then it's just like these subtle nuanced details that are getting out of control. And so in that situation, that's why it's good to sort of handshake agree, like, hey, by the way, I want to make this good and I want to make you extremely happy with it. But at some point in time, the tweaking's got to stop, because if it's you're just turning this up 1 and that down 1 and this up over a half and that down a quarter, then it's like, okay, the mix is done. It's just about what small nuances that may or may not matter at the end of the day. But if we're on mix 10 and the client says, I'm so sorry, something's wrong, I missed it, I'm very open to recalling and doing version number 11 or 12 just to make sure it's right. Thanks for watching, guys. I'm Darrell Thorp. Thank you so much for joining me. Until next time.